Hello, everybody. So I'm Dr. Yan Yu. Thanks for having me here. I'm honored to be here and to be able to answer your questions. What's really cool about this is that you get to ask questions in an anonymous format, so there's no judgment whatsoever. Nobody will know who asked each question. And I'm happy to answer any and all questions, so there won't be any censoring of any questions or anything like that. There's so much misinformation out there that I'm very keen to help clarify some issues and maybe worries and things that you may have. I'm likely not your family physician, so don't take my comments as medical advice. Definitely ask your personal family physician if you have any personal healthcare issues or questions about the vaccine related to your own healthcare condition. But having said that, I can answer general questions regarding the facts behind the vaccines. And I'm very honored to be here and I'm keen to get started.
Okay, so the first question I have here is that everyone talks about side effects directly after vaccinations, but we are being told nothing of what could be expected long term. There is already talk of heart issues and potential fertility issues. How can we feel safe to receive a vaccine that can cause problems that could affect us more dangerously than COVID, since we are aware not all people are severely affected by COVID?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there's multiple aspects to this question. There's the short-term side effects, and then there's a question about whether there is long-term side effects from the vaccines or not. And I'll put it to you that depending on where you get your information and resources, there's a ton of misinformation about this. And so you really have to be careful about where you get your sources of information. So if you look at the credible academic literature out there that talks about the possible issues, so there's question of potential fertility issues. So I'll just say right now that vaccines do not cause fertility issues, especially the COVID vaccine. It does not cause fertility issues in people. There's already talk about heart issues. So Health Canada maintains a database of all reported adverse events that people get chronologically after the vaccine, whether or not they are caused by the vaccine. And so in the Health Canada database, there's 25 people who got myocarditis, and that's inflammation of the heart muscle after the vaccine. But again, we don't know if what happened chronologically after the vaccine is a direct consequence of the vaccine or not, because life happens. And so you can stub your toe after the vaccination and, was it caused by the vaccine? Probably not. Now, the key is to compare whether there's a equal or similar baseline rate between how often myocarditis happens in people who have not received the vaccine or just in the baseline population in general versus the prevalence of myocarditis in people who have been vaccinated. And they have been doing that. Now, keep in mind that myocarditis is something that we know as doctors happens all the time. Some of you might have had kids who got hand, foot, and mouth disease, or some of you might have had hand, foot, and mouth disease. So the virus that causes hand, foot, and mouth disease causes myocarditis 5% of the time. Similarly with COVID, COVID itself will cause myocarditis. Keep in mind, we have very good tools to be able to actually pick the needles in the haystack to find the actual true and very rare side effects. So the fact that we were able to find the blood clots as a side effect of the AstraZeneca vaccines when the blood clots were happening at a rate of 1 in 100,000, that's really like picking a needle out of a haystack. And if we can find that using our existing systems, then I'm pretty sure that we can also find other true side effects from the vaccines. Now your question also touches upon whether we have enough data about the vaccine, whether the vaccines were too rushed, or whether we have enough research behind the technology behind these vaccines. And the answer is yes, because even though it's not clearly communicated with the public, we have these mRNA vaccines that have never been used before, and people are all talking about it as new. But really, if you dig into the academic literature about this, the research that goes behind the mRNA vaccines have been there ever since 1989. So that was when the first mRNA technology was applied in a scientific manner to solve a particular problem. And going back many years since 1989. mRNA technology has been well researched, it's been well established as something that can be a very potent vaccine source, but it can also be a cancer treatment. There's lots of research going around even before the mRNA technology was adapted for COVID. mRNA is a very unstable molecule. It's very easily broken down. What we've been able to do as in medicine is we've been able to take the mRNA, and then we've been able to stabilize it in a still transient lipid sort of glob of basically fat, and put it into somebody's body so that we can have the mRNA take effect, but then it will just get spontaneously degraded after about a few hours or a few days. It doesn't last in the body, and so biologically speaking, whether the chances that something as naturally very fragile as mRNA and the lipid capsule that it's transported in can have any long-term consequences on the body itself, there's very little biological plausibility that can happen. So again, we don't have evidence to prove, because obviously this vaccine has only been in use for about a year or less, but the chances are very, very low.
Okay,
so personally, I feel safe about it. Yeah.
So we have a few questions around the second dose. So there's a question about the constantly changing timelines and whether or not that second dose window that's changing, if that's based in science or supply. And then we also have a question around what the difference is between the first and second dose. And also, someone has heard the second vaccine doses have more serious side effects than the first one. So I'm wondering if you can just respond to some of those questions around the second dose.
So great observation. There have been a lot of changing timelines, and I'm going to clarify some of that now. So in the initial studies, the phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 studies, looking at the safety and efficacy of the vaccine for it to, for it to get Health Canada approval and FDA approval in the first place, the interval between the first and second dose was 4 weeks, 3 to 4 weeks. And that was really the minimum window of time. We don't want it any shorter than that, because really the immune response to the first vaccine dose will be fully finished in about 2 to 3 weeks. And so to inject a second dose any closer to that would not be able to leverage the memory of the immune system to build a stronger level of immune response for the future. And so 3 to 4 weeks is the minimum time window within which you can inject a second dose. We have data about other vaccines and vaccines in general that we know the further out you do the second dose, the stronger the immune response that second dose generates, and the stronger protection and the more long-lasting protection that second dose creates. So for example, the Shingrix vaccine, which came out in 2018, which acts against shingles, the second dose, that's also a 2-dose vaccine, and the second dose for that is 2 to 6 months after the first dose. So again, whenever I look at something, I don't just look at the guidelines and the sort of rules around it. I also think about the biological plausibility, and based on my understanding of the biology and physiology underlying all of these new drugs and new vaccines. And I have to say, it does make sense to have the vaccine dose, the second dose, spaced out a bit further than the sort of 3 to 4 weeks that were prescribed in the initial studies. Keeping in mind that the initial studies had a 3 to 4 week dosing interval because they needed to see what would happen. They needed to have the full vaccine effect out there amongst the vaccinated trial participants so that they can evaluate the study and have it completed in as short a time as possible to get the vaccine to market for us as quickly as possible. So in later studies, because we're always evaluating these vaccines, we don't just stop at the end of the phase 3 study. There's more phase 3 studies, there's phase 4 studies for aftermarket studies. In later studies, we've looked at, for example, the AstraZeneca vaccine and compared the difference in immunogenicity, so how much immune response that each dose generates, with the first dose being at 4 weeks and the first dose being at 12 weeks. And it turns out that the AstraZeneca vaccine, the second dose is even more effective once the waiting period is delayed to 12 weeks after the first dose, as opposed to the as opposed to the four weeks after the first dose. So with the AstraZeneca vaccine, I feel fairly good about having my patients be vaccinated within that 12-week window as opposed to a 4-week window. With the mRNA vaccines, I haven't come across any published data about that yet. It makes sense. There's good biological plausibility that if we delay it for maybe a couple of weeks, it's not going to be a big deal. But again, we don't have the data to fully support that. Whether that makes a difference, I'm not too sure. But right now, it just seems like we don't really have a choice because there's so many people that need to be vaccinated. We have limited supply, and so hopefully, once we get more supply, we can actually have people vaccinated in the manner that the studies actually prescribe. But again, if I was to say on the list of things that you should be concerned about when it comes to, do I worry about preventing myself from getting infected by COVID versus do I worry about how long of a wait my second dose will be, I would worry about the former first, and I would worry less about the latter.
The second part was around side effects from the second vaccine, and hearing that it's worse than the first one. Is that true?
Okay, so that's a great question. Typically, we have to understand from that what the side effects are and what they represent. So side effects are typically just the body's immune response against the vaccine, and so basically we want side effects. We want, or if you get side effects, it's not a big deal because it's to be expected. So the side effects would be maybe some fatigue, some fevers and chills, some loss of energy, some muscle pain, maybe some arm pain. But and really, if you think about what's happening in the body after the second dose, the first dose is for the immune system to go, oh, that's a new thing there. Hello, I'm going to say hi, and I'm going to form a little bit of a response to it, and I'm going to keep some of you in memory, just so that if you come back again in the future, I'm going to really be waiting for you. The second dose is that second time the body's exposed to the viral particle, and so the immune response goes bonkers. It's like, okay, you know what? You're a foreigner. You shouldn't be here. I recognize you now. I'm going to mount a huge response to fight you. And that's what we want. That's what we need to actually build that high level of immune response to the actual virus itself. And so, but if you think about it that way, it makes sense that after the second dose, the immune system will mount a stronger response, and therefore you will get stronger side effects. And so, but having said that, the side effects are transient for many, many people, for most people actually, and they only last about a day or two. So it's really, actually, think about it as a reassuring way if you do get side effects, reassuring that your body is mounting the right response to it. Doesn't mean that if you don't get side effects, your body isn't mounting a response. You probably just don't feel it. But if you do get side effects that are more intense after the second dose, like I did, I got a bit of a more stronger response after the second dose, and I was fairly reassured that my body was doing its job. And the third part to that chain of questions
was just around what the difference is between the first and second dose.
The difference. So there is no chemical difference between the constituents of the first and second dose. They all contain the same thing, the same amount of mRNA particles or the viral vector particles that contains the bit of the virus. Genome that then our bodies use to produce the viral protein that then our immune systems respond to. But in terms of the response that the first and second dose generates, I talked a little bit about that. And they were actually able to quantify the difference in the amount of antibodies that were generated. So antibodies are these immune particles, immune proteins that the body makes to fight off different pathogens, bacteria, viruses, and things like that. The antibody response to the second dose is far greater than the antibody response to the first dose, and far greater than any antibody response from people who've actually caught COVID. So there's a belief that if you caught COVID, you already have immune memory or antibodies against the virus, and you probably don't need the vaccines. Well, actually, it turns out that after 2 doses of the vaccine, your level of protection is like at least twice as better than the small level of protection you can obtain after being infected with COVID. And keeping in mind also that the antibody response after a full vaccination series, so after both doses, is going to be more robust against the variants, whereas with your response after a COVID infection, it's likely going to be only good against that variant that you were actually infected by and not against all the variants. So I hope that answers your question as well.
Okay, the next question I'm going to go to next is, why get a vaccine for an illness that has affected less than 5% of the country, especially if it doesn't prevent you from getting COVID or spreading it to others and has no long-term studies?
So first, I'm going to challenge you where you found your information that it doesn't have an effect on preventing COVID infection, because the vaccine does prevent COVID infection. So if you look at the studies that were actually done, the vaccines do quite a good job of that. It prevents viral infection in about 95% of people who come into contact with COVID, the virus. And so I would encourage people to look at some of the actual scientific literature around that. And in terms of preventing transmission, there's three things around that. One, if the vaccine prevents you from getting the virus in the first place, and we know it does, then you'll be less likely to transmit it because you won't get it in the first place. So that's just kind of common sense, right? There's other studies. Again, I've talked about these other studies that were done after the initial studies that were published about the vaccines. And these studies show that even if you're amongst the very few who have had both shots of the vaccine and who still are unlucky enough to be infected with the virus, you have a reduced viral count in your body. So you have less viral particles in your body if you get the vaccine, and it makes you less sick. It reduces your chances of getting into hospital and dying from the virus. And because you have a reduced viral count, that also means you shed less of the virus and you're less transmissible. That was actually borne out in 2 studies that were done in the UK looking at household transmission. So we do have data that actually shows that the vaccine actually prevents transmission of the virus even if you get the virus. Now, here's some actual data about how likely you are to actually get the COVID infection once you've been fully vaccinated. So in the USA, from January to end of April, they've fully vaccinated about 100 million people. And out of that 100 million people, only 10,000 got COVID after being fully vaccinated. Fully vaccinated being 14 days after your second dose. So that's about 0.01% of people who've been fully vaccinated who end up unlucky enough to get COVID. Most people are protected, and so that's how rare it is. So I hope that answers your question regarding, does the vaccine actually protect against COVID infection, which it does.
Okay, so we have quite a few questions here around mixing different kinds of vaccines. So for example, having AstraZeneca as your first and then Pfizer as your second, and whether or not it's safe to mix vaccines, whether or not Canada is the only country advising that it is possible to mix vaccines. So I'm just wondering if you can provide some clarity around those.
Yes, so great question. Especially because, folks after getting the AstraZeneca for their first shot are a little bit wary about getting the AstraZeneca for the second shot, given that the side effect of blood clots have come out, even though the rate of blood clots after the second shot is like 6 times less, at least, than the rate of blood clots after the first shot, like 1 in 500,000 to 1 million. But anyway, going back to the question of mixing vaccines. So the question of mixing vaccines was first initially researched in the UK, then it continues to be researched around the world. And the latest we have on that comes from, I can actually send folks a link about this from NACI, the National Advisory Committee on Immunizations, which is that if you got the AstraZeneca vaccine, it's safe, and it's safe, and it's also perhaps even desirable to get an mRNA vaccine after you get your AstraZeneca vaccine. If you had an mRNA vaccine, so Pfizer or Moderna as your first dose, we recommend that you still stick with an mRNA vaccine for your second dose and don't go to the AstraZeneca for your second dose. And that's really just because you have this mRNA vaccine that is safer and also more strongly protects you. And so why would you switch to an AstraZeneca for your second dose? And there's also a question of whether, if you got Pfizer, could you get Moderna for the second dose? If you got Moderna, could you get Pfizer for your second dose? And the recommendation is if there's limited supply and there's just none of that same mRNA brand that you had for your first dose, you can actually take the other brand for your second dose and it will be fine. And Canada is definitely not the only country that's allowing or recommending this. So like I said, the first studies actually done on this was actually in the UK and in Germany, and in many parts of the world, they're probably recommending the same thing.
Okay, so we're approaching our time here, so I just wanted to check in, Dr. Yu, if you are able to stay on a little bit before 9, if we want to get to more questions, or if you have to jet off.
I am scheduled until 9:30 or however long you guys want to keep me for.
Okay.
These are really important questions, and I'm happy to answer them.
Perfect. So the next question I have for you is, at the start of this, the COVID vaccine was not okay for children, but now it is okay for 12 years and older. What changed so that is okay? And secondly, are there any reported complications for children? And third, is it best to have regular childhood vaccines first, then COVID shot, or is there preference?
Okay, great series of questions. I actually found it in the chat, so I hope I'm not forgetting any parts of the question. Okay, so at the start of this, it wasn't that the COVID vaccine was not okay for children. It was simply that, like with all studies for new drugs, the studies are not done in kids. They're not done in kids, they're not done in pregnant people, they're not done in immunocompromised people, and that's just the way that all studies are done for new drugs. It doesn't mean that the vaccines are not okay for those populations. It just means that the study protocol was not done that way, just because no studies have been done that way. So I hope that clarifies things a little bit. And now since then, Pfizer has actually done a study looking at the safety and efficacy for their vaccine on kids 12 and older. And they've shown that it's safe and it's really effective, really effective. And so what that tells us is that, number one, science is continually doing research on these vaccines, and that, yes, we now have data to support the fact that these vaccines are safe for 12-year-olds, and that's why the guidance changed. It was probably already safe for 12-year-olds and up. It's just that governments didn't want to make that guideline without the data backing it up. So that's what's changed. Reported complications for children. So there's always reported side effects or reported effects after the vaccine. So they're called adverse effects after the vaccine. But again, these just because somebody reports an adverse reaction to a vaccine doesn't mean that the adverse reaction was caused by the vaccine. So there's actually good numbers. You can look this up yourself. So it's so Health Canada has a health info base for COVID vaccine safety. I can share the link with Callista and get that. You know what? I'll just make a public announcement and so that people can see the link, because it's a really good website where the Government of Canada publishes all of the and I just sent that in the published chat now. I'm not sure if you can see that or not. That you can actually see how many people are reporting these adverse reactions. Now, they don't actually specify if they're in kids or not, but there will always be reports of adverse side effects. But again, in the studies that were done, the adverse side effects, besides the typical side effects you get from the vaccine, from the immune response to the vaccine, there is no safety signals and safety risks for kids 12 years and older getting the Pfizer vaccine. There are studies ongoing right now with Moderna and Pfizer looking at vaccinating kids even younger. And so soon we'll have those numbers to confirm the fact that younger people can still get the vaccine in a safe and efficacious way. And so expect those data to come out in the next few months, and for guidelines to further change regarding that. Now, Callista, because I posted that link, I lost where the question was being asked.
I think the last part was, is it best to have regular childhood vaccines first, then COVID shot, or is there a preference?
Okay, yeah, I can't find the question in the chat anymore, but so regular childhood vaccines happen at various times. So most of it happens before the age of 2, and then some of it, like 1 or 2, happens at around like grade 8 or something like that. So presumably right now, because the vaccines aren't approved for people younger than 12, most of the childhood vaccines are going to be done. But with the regular vaccine, like the meningococcus vaccine is around grade 8. I think there's the Gardasil vaccine that protects against cervical cancer and genital warts at around grade 5 or so, the 3-shot series. As long as you have at least a 2-week window between each vaccination, you should be good. That just allows the body's immune system to respond safely to that one vaccine, and then the immune system kind of like goes back to its normal level, and it can respond to future vaccines. So yes, you can do them at the same general time period, but just leave about 2 weeks or 3 weeks of time in between each vaccination, and you should be good.
Okay. Just for anyone who does have to hop off because we are past that 9 o'clock time limit, we will share out the recording afterwards just for your information. So another question I have here is, how does the vaccine transfer through breast milk? Are there any concerns with breastfeeding moms getting vaccinated?
Yeah, so great question. The vaccine itself does not transfer through breast milk. So if you think about it, the vaccine gets into your muscle, okay, and it stays in your muscle. It gets taken up by the cells of your muscle. And then the muscle cells actually produce the spike protein from the genomic information in the vaccine, and the immune system reacts against that. That's why your arm is sore. When the immune system reacts against the vaccine, you have antibodies that are produced. Those are produced by your own body, and those float about in your bloodstream. And if you're breastfeeding, it can go into your breast, and it can be excreted to your breast milk and transferred to your baby. Now that happens naturally. So if you get a cold when you're breastfeeding and your body develops antibodies against the cold virus, you're still going to transfer antibodies to your baby. And your baby actually also gets your antibodies that you have from your own personal childhood vaccinations against polio, against tetanus. So those things will be floating around in your body anyway. So we have tons and tons of antibodies just floating around in our blood, waiting to react to things that may happen to us. Those things are all going to be those antibodies are all going to be transferred to your baby through breast milk anyway. And that's part of the benefit of breastfeeding, is that you convey passive immunity to your baby through the transfer of breast milk. And so that's a good thing. Concerns with breastfeeding moms getting vaccinated? I mean, I haven't heard any. Again, because the vaccine itself doesn't transfer to through the breast milk to the baby. It's more only the antibodies. The concern is more with moms who are considering pregnancy or who are pregnant. So that's. Did you want me to speak a little bit about that?
It wasn't a question, but if you want to, feel free to go ahead.
Sure. Okay. Yeah. So the concern with getting the vaccine during pregnancy is that we don't. Again, when the studies were initially being done, it's normally never part of the normal regulatory process to include pregnant women in the study design process looking at new drugs. And so we don't have data that tells us whether the vaccine is going to be safe for pregnant women or not. But we do have data from actually what happened after the vaccines were approved and released, because like in the US as of March, so again, this is out of date data, but as of March, over 30,000 pregnant women have received either the Pfizer or the Moderna vaccine, and there were no differences in baseline rates of any adverse outcomes to the pregnancy or to the fetus in those groups who have been vaccinated with the mRNA vaccines versus a baseline group of pregnant women just in the general population who have not been vaccinated. Obviously, there have been many more pregnant people who have gotten the vaccination after March. And I would guess that there's probably not just 30,000 people who've been vaccinated who are pregnant now. It's probably like almost I don't know. There's a ton more people now, and the fact that we haven't heard of a signal of any safety signals that are caused by the vaccines suggests that it is safe. But then again, we don't have confirmed randomized controlled trial data for the pregnant population. So there's no definitive data that it is safe. But then again, I also go back to the biological plausibility. If you look at the way that the vaccine works in the body, it there is no biological plausibility of how the vaccine can affect the fetus. And so that is reassuring to me as a physician when I advise patients. Obviously, it is one person's personal choice, and just like vaccinations are. So, but we're always here to help provide the most sort of up-to-date information. And the most up-to-date information is that there doesn't seem to be a safety signal that has come out of our observations of pregnant women getting vaccinated so far.
Okay, so the next question I have for you, and I might mispronounce these words. I have heard that quercetin with bromelain, is a great alternative to the vaccine. What is your professional advice on this?
So quercetin, I've not heard about quercetin and bromelain. I'm not sure what they are. I would caution you against against these sort of published alternatives to the vaccine, especially because these seem to be just chemical names, and they don't trigger that immune response to the actual virus itself that the vaccines do. Whenever you read about stuff like this, you should actually look at who is writing it, and if it's in a fairly sort of niche or alternative news media, you want to think about why that news media is wanting to promote such information. Could they be possibly benefiting financially from, sharing, frankly, what is misinformation? It's unfortunate, really, that that this is out there and it's confusing people. But the thing is, when you want a vaccination, you want a product that when you take it, it will have a specific response to a specific disease. And the way the vaccines do that is it actually contains a bit of the virus itself, but not the whole virus. So it's not going to cause COVID and it's not going to cause disease, but it contains a bit of the viral genome, so that we can make a little bit of the specific virus to give our bodies specific defense against the virus. And so we know that it will work against the virus, whereas this just doesn't make sense. And it doesn't make sense that any generic chemical is going to give you a specific immune response against a specific disease. Some people get hopeful about stories like this. I would say it's probably not a good idea, and it might actually just cause more harmful side effects to you from taking in these foreign chemicals than if you were to just avoid it.
Maybe as a follow-up to that, could you talk about the vaccine development and timelines? This person states that many of the people they speak with will not receive the vaccine because of how quickly the vaccine was developed and rolled out to the public. So curiosity around if there was any step bypassed in the testing stage of this vaccine versus previous vaccines.
Yeah, so great question. And I've had that conversation with my own patients very, very often. First, let me go back to saying that the technology behind the mRNA vaccine and the AstraZeneca vaccine is not new. They've been doing mRNA technology since 1989. It was actually adopted by a group called the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations, which is an international organization that prepares for pandemics as early as 2018. So we have the technology that is safe, even before COVID appeared. Now, in terms of the COVID vaccine development, it still actually went through the entire process of new drug development, and the FDA has a very standard process for this. The phase 1 trials looking at safety, the phase 2 trials looking at effectiveness, and the phase 3 trials looking at efficacy at the real world level for a large group of people, at least 30,000 people. And so it did go through all of these phases in the appropriate way. What was cut down was the amount of red tape and bureaucracy between each of these stages, and also the way they analyzed the data. So in the past, when there was no hurry or when there was no pandemic and when people weren't dying in as great numbers as they were, the way that these studies were analyzed was the studies would be done, and then the regulators would sit back and have a nice coffee and just, take their sweet time in reviewing the data after each phase of the study was done. Now, for the COVID vaccines, governments have mandated that the regulators actually review the data as they come in And then, so think about like a typical bureaucrat regulator. They got the stack of paperwork that they have to review. The government has mandated that they actually bring the COVID studies to the top of their list. So that was what changed to make the approval of the vaccines so quick. No scientifically necessary steps were skipped to bring these vaccines to market.
So I have this question that says, I heard the vaccine can affect menstruation. If someone already deals with heavy periods, should they be concerned about this side effect?
So the vaccines do not affect menstruation. Again, it was not found to be part of the side effect profile of the vaccines, and from a biological plausibility perspective, the vaccine does not affect menstruation. So I would say if you exchange a change in your menstruation after the vaccine, it's probably because of the fact that your menstrual cycles will be changing anyway, as opposed to because of the vaccine. And yeah, the caution there is to not attribute anything that comes after the vaccine as a cause, as caused by the vaccine.
Okay, so I have, I think, 2 questions remaining, unless anyone has last ones that they want to type in.
Feel free to ask follow-up questions too.
Yeah, for sure. So I have one here. What is the longest time you can wait for the second dose?
What is the longest time you can wait for the second dose? Nobody knows. Typically, the question is, how quickly can I get the second dose instead of the longest time after second dose? I probably wouldn't get it after, like I probably will not. I mean, if I had to wait a long time, I would still get it whenever I'm able to get it, regardless of how long I've waited. But usually what people ask would be, how quickly can I get a second dose? And I would say that from a scientific plausibility perspective, you don't want to get it within that 4-week window after your first dose, for the reasons that I've talked about. You don't want to blunt the effect of the first dose with the second dose, because the second dose will be less effective within that 4-week window. But in terms of how long you can wait, there's really no answer for that. Just get it after 4 weeks and you'll be good.
Okay, so I think this is a follow-up to the earlier question around the impact, around the 5% affecting the population. So the follow-up here is, it has affected less than 5% of the population per the real stats of cases versus our Canadian population. It does not appear to be as infectious as the news, and government wants us to think it is and be afraid of it. What are your thoughts on the low amount of the population being affected?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And so let me ask you, why do you think less than 5% of the population has been affected? Well, if you look at the data around the world, in the US, the population that's been affected is over 14%. In other parts of the world, it's even greater. And the answer is because the government has put in place good public health restrictions and lockdowns to be able to have the spread of this virus be contained to that 5% level or less than 5% level. So that actually suggests that in Canada, we've been doing better compared with other countries to contain the spread of this disease. So if we didn't have lockdowns, if we didn't take public health precautions against the virus, if we just went around business as usual, we would have this virus affecting much more than just 5% of the population. And we would have it maybe even affecting all parts of the population, because, that's what viruses do. They spread very insidiously from people to people. And here, keep in mind here with the coronavirus, we're talking about the Wayne Gretzky of all viruses here. So there's no way to estimate just how much damage that this could cause had it not been for the good public health guidelines that we've had here in Canada. So I question your premise that it has affected less than 5% of the population, and it will only affect 5% of the population. So that's addressing the first part of your question. So yeah, it actually is more infectious than that if we let it roam. And the fact that we don't want these lockdown guidelines, we don't want these lockdown measures forever. We want to go back to life as usual. We want to be able to hang out with our friends. We want to be able to travel again. when these lockdown measures are lifted, is not a question of if, but it's when, then the virus potentially can spread unchecked if we do not have this level of defense within our own bodies that's conveyed to us by the vaccines to be able to defend against the virus. Let me just read the other parts of your question. Yeah. News is fairly infectious, and I do agree. We have quite a crazy 24-hour news cycle that likes to hype things up. However, looking at this from my perspective as a healthcare professional, and I have friends who work in the ICUs and the emergency rooms, and I've actually, like every month or so, my clinic has weekend call rotations, and for doctors to call patients who have had COVID infections. This is serious. This does affect people. This does kill people, and if we don't keep it in check, first with our lockdowns and then with the vaccines, then a hell of a lot more people are going to be affected, more than just the 5%. So I hope that answers your question, and feel free to ask follow-up questions to this.
There's a question here. If you tested positive for COVID, is there a period you should wait before getting the vaccine?
Great question. Yeah. So if you tested positive for COVID, you should wait until you've recovered from the viral infection first before you get the vaccine. And for most people, that's when their period of self-isolation is up. But for other people, it could mean after they've gone back home from being in the hospital, or after their symptoms completely go away. And the reason for waiting to get the vaccine after you're recovered from the virus is because when you're fighting off the virus, your immune system is already reacting against the virus. It's probably not going to be as responsive to the vaccine as if the vaccine was introduced at a time when the immune system was quiet.
So next question here, do you recommend we continue wearing masks and distancing after the restrictions are gone in a couple of weeks?
Yeah, so this question really goes back to how the virus is transmitted. And the short answer, yes, I do recommend people follow public health guidelines after the vaccinations and after the restrictions are lifted. And the reason is that there's so many reasons for that. Number one, COVID is not going to go away after everybody gets vaccinated. Or, you know what, if 100% of the global population can be vaccinated, then it will likely go away. It has a higher chance of going away, disappearing from the face of the earth than not, because of the principle and the benefits of herd immunity. But you know, given the level of vaccine uptake we have in our society, with right now with more than 30% of the population still have not had their first dose, I think it's likely that COVID will stay. And so you don't want to be that 0.01% that is fully vaccinated and still gets the viral infection. That would just be so unlucky. And also we've seen that with the public health guidelines that we've been in place over this last year, the rate of other respiratory infections have just basically fallen off the cliff. So no flu, which is excellent. I haven't seen a cold in my clinical practice since early 2020. So that's been great. From the studies of how COVID is spread, there has also been more studies about how other respiratory infections have spread, and the role of little aerosols, little small particles, little droplets that hang in the air and that gets suspended in the air, mostly around us. You know, it's more concentrated close to where the person who's transmitting or spreading the infection is, but it hangs in the air. And that learning has led to us wearing masks, even just to contain, because some of us, when we get these infections, we don't know that we've been infected because we don't get symptoms. And so if we don't have symptoms, we don't know that we're infected. But if we wear masks, we can protect other people around us from the unintentional transmission of whatever respiratory virus that we have. So yes, I do recommend that we keep wearing masks, keep washing your hands, things like that, even after the pandemic is over, because it will help prevent future spread of any sort of respiratory viruses.
Okay, the next question I have here is, why get the vaccine if you have tested positive for COVID? Would you not already have the antibodies, which would be better than a vaccine?
Yeah. So I think I may have answered this already, but to clarify, if you got COVID, the amount of antibodies that you have is going to be far less than a full series of vaccinations can give you, and they've actually measured this. So I've actually read the papers that have measured this. And also, when you have had COVID, the immune memory response against that is going to be messy compared with when you have the vaccine against COVID. So when you have when you have a COVID infection, your immune system will build up memory. There's no way to control what sort of memory the immune system builds up in response to the virus. So you have the whole viral particle being in your body, and your immune system can build up memory against, say, a bit of the membrane or a bit of other proteins in the virus that's not specific to the virus, but it's shared between different types of coronaviruses. And so what that means is you don't get as specific an immune memory against COVID, and any new strains of COVID that do come along and infect you might still infect you. So there have been reports of people who have had the original strain of COVID, for example, in Brazil, and then the P1 variant in Brazil comes along and reinfects them. So whereas with a vaccine against the virus, we have the vaccine producing in your bodies a very specific part of the virus particle called the spike protein, which is actually very specific to the coronavirus. And so your immune system will be specific for COVID-19. And also it also protects you against variants, because when you have the entire spike protein, only parts of the spike protein mutate at any given time to give you the different variants. There's other parts of the spike protein that's conserved between all the variants. And so if you build up immunity antibodies against all the different parts of the spike protein, that can actually confer a degree of immunity against multiple different types of variants, regardless of what comes up. So I hope that answers your question there.
Okay, so we're hitting 9:25 here, and we have a few left. I'm wondering, I might just do kind of one final question here, but I'm wondering, Dr. Yu, if we can follow up with you on some of these questions that we didn't get to. Would that be okay?
I got time if you guys have time.
Okay, well, we'll keep going then.
Yeah.
How effective is a single dose of the vaccine against the Delta variant? Also, the government of Alberta is planning on moving ahead with the stampede. Is it advisable to attend such an event with only a single dose?
Yeah, a single dose is not very effective against the Delta variant. It's about 30% effective. I love going to Stampede. I'm raised in Calgary. I will not be going to the Stampede this year, even though I'm fully vaccinated. It's just too risky, and I would definitely not advise my patients to attend the Stampede on only a single dose. Even though it is in an outdoor setting, which mitigates the risk of viral transmission, the fact that you have so many people, and you may even have people coming in from different parts of the country, or maybe even from other countries, coming in and attending this event, it's definitely not. I would agree with most of my clinical colleagues that it is more dangerous to attend this year as opposed to other years. I would at least wait until you've had both shots of the vaccine first, and both shots actually confer a defense of about 80–90% against even the Delta variant. And we're talking the mRNA vaccines here. We're not talking about the AstraZeneca vaccines. The AstraZeneca vaccines do have a reduced efficacy against the variants, and so I'll just put that out there.
Okay, so this seems like a comment, but I'm just curious if you have any kind of response to it. So the government restrictions and lockdowns haven't significantly changed my life or anyone else I know. We have continued on as normal, other than wearing a mask in stores, and no one I know personally has got COVID, even though we have still seen our friends and family on a regular basis. So just wondering if you have any thoughts of how that's possible, or any kind of response to that comment there.
Yeah, great. So I'm glad that you haven't been personally affected by COVID, and that that you are following the government restrictions measures, and which have protected the vast majority of the population. And what likely happened is that because of the protective measures of the restrictions, the virus likely existed in a very low amount in some of the more rural areas of Alberta. And so because the prevalence of the disease is low, it doesn't affect people as much. And that's largely because of the travel restrictions and also the other public health measures that you've put into place, like you mentioned, your masks around, things like that. So when those rules go away, what will happen? And right now nobody knows, but based on how quickly this virus spreads, it's fairly safe to say that when the restrictions are lifted, when travel opens up again, the virus is going to be spreading much easier without some sort of innate protection that we have within our own bodies that's conferred to us from the vaccines. So I actually work in Fort Smith, Northwest Territories as well, and over there people feel safe even without vaccinations. It was one of the safest places to live and work in Canada. Very, very small community, 2,500 people. People were sort of wearing masks, but not really wearing masks to the same extent that we are in the big cities of Alberta. And nobody got sick because the baseline prevalence of the virus was so low in that setting. And again, that's a testament to the great public health measures that the Northwest Territories government had put into place. So good on you. I'm glad you stay safe.
So on that note of, when things open up, there's this question around, so the flu vaccine has not eradicated the flu. Flu cases were abnormally low. How can we expect this vaccine to eradicate COVID when there are reports that 60% of active cases in the States are fully vaccinated people? And just a statement that they have friends in nursing homes saying the same thing in Alberta.
Yeah. So there's a couple of points to your question. Your point about 60% of active cases in the States are fully vaccinated people.
I would strongly caution people to avoid something called the base rate bias, because when you say half of people infected were vaccinated, that's not the same as saying half of vaccinated people were infected. So let me just say that again. Half of the people that were infected were vaccinated is not the same as half of vaccinated people becoming infected. Okay? So I'll just demonstrate this with a simple diagram here from a website called Your Local Epidemiologist. So say you take population with 100 people, okay, and an 85% vaccination rate. 85% of people will be vaccinated, and 15 people in this 100-person community are not vaccinated. You can have 4 total COVID cases, and if the 50% of these cases are among the vaccinated, then you would basically get 2 people from the 85 people who were vaccinated getting infected, and 2 people from the 15 people who were unvaccinated getting infected. And so from something like this, you can say a scary number like 50% of infections were among the vaccinated, but really you can see that the rate of infection amongst the vaccinated is only about 2%. When you put it that way, that's not nearly as scary as saying 50% of infections were amongst the vaccinated. So again, you want to be aware of this bias, and you want to be aware of the fact that saying something like half of people infected were vaccinated, that's not the same as saying half of vaccinated people became infected. It's just not the case. Be very careful of that.
I would wonder where you got the report that 60% of active cases in the States are fully vaccinated, because the data from the CDC that I'm quoting, that I quoted earlier in the session, which is you had from January to end of April, you had 100 million people fully vaccinated, and only about 12,000, 10,000 people from that fully vaccinated 100 million people got COVID. That's about 0.01%. It doesn't jive with the numbers that you're seeing. So I would question, number one, where you're getting this information and whether it's from a credible source. So definitely check in on that. And I'll just give you 2 Alberta examples. One are the data published on a population basis, and one coming from the nursing homes that I work at. On a population basis, we have seen that 90%, over 90% of the cases here in Alberta from January onwards were in people who were not vaccinated. And about 88% of the deaths in this province were from people who are not fully vaccinated, and that's just coming from the data that we have here. So again, that doesn't jive with the data that you're reading. So I question that. From my own experience working in a long-term care home here in Calgary, during the second wave, when there were no vaccinations, there were so many deaths, so many sick people in long-term care. It was horrendous. I was on call in the long-term care homes in Calgary during the week of Christmas, and my phone was just ringing nonstop because nurses were calling me about people who were not able to breathe well because they were suffering from COVID. In early January, there was a mass campaign to vaccinate everybody in long-term care, and patients in long-term care, about 98% fully vaccinated. They've had both doses of the Moderna vaccine. And during the third wave in March and April, or March, April, May, we've actually seen no deaths, like just no deaths coming from the long-term care center that I work at. There have been even like almost zero cases. The cases actually come from the staff at the long-term care center. The minority of staff who have not been vaccinated have brought cases into the long-term care centers, but there have been no spread of cases within the long-term care centers themselves between the residents. And so that to me is just one anecdotal bit of evidence that the vaccines actually do work. If you notice, if you follow the number of deaths that Dina Hinshaw and the government has been reporting over the last few months, you'll have noticed that the number of deaths in the second wave was far more than the number of deaths in the third wave. And it was mostly because folks in long-term care, the most vulnerable people, they were dying from COVID. And those numbers showed up in the second wave as deaths versus not in the third wave, because people in long-term care were protected, and they were protected fairly well. Does that answer the question? Let me see here. The flu vaccine, yeah, okay. And yeah, the flu vaccine has not eradicated the flu, mostly because flu is actually something that is quite, the flu virus, there's many different strains of the flu virus, more than the 4 strains of COVID that we have. So finding a vaccine that protects against all strains is very difficult. And also, you know, we're not saying here that the vaccines for COVID will eradicate COVID. I don't think I have said that, or I don't think anybody has said that. It's more to give you the protection against COVID and the various strains of COVID were you to be exposed to COVID in the future. Most likely we will not be able to eradicate COVID. Most likely people are going to need a booster shot of COVID vaccine every single year to respond to the changing variants. But that said, we have great vaccines that seem to have great efficacy against this virus that is very protective.
So we have a couple of questions around like loss of smell and taste. So a question about whether or not, if someone has lost their sense of smell, would this have been because of COVID or not? And then a question about whether or not people get their sense of smell and taste back, or if they don't ever, some people.
Yeah. So there's many parts to this great question. One is, you know, we can only test for COVID if you get tested. There's been a lot of cases of true COVID that have not been tested, and so do you actually have COVID if you have the symptoms or have some of the symptoms, but you haven't gotten tested? And what I'll say to that is a lot of the symptoms of COVID are very non-specific. For example, if you have a loss of smell or taste, you know, some people just get loss of smell or taste because they have sinus buildup because of allergies in, you know, when they have the nasal congestion and the sinus mucus buildup that blocks their smell receptors in their nose. And that might not be from COVID. So I'd say if the only symptom that you lost is your sense of smell, you know, and if you've had this happen before, you know, especially if you have a history of allergies or things like that, you probably don't have COVID. You probably should get tested though, just to make sure that, you know, if you do have COVID, you don't spread around to other people. One cannot say that if you had only lost your sense of smell that you definitely have COVID. And then regarding the ability to get that sense of smell back, that has actually been one of the more serious sort of well, not serious from a life-threatening sense, but in terms of a quality of life sense, there's a lot of people who get COVID who never get their sense of smell and taste back, or who haven't yet after many, many months. New York Times has actually done fairly good reporting about this. Actually, one New York Times food critic actually got COVID and still hasn't gotten their sense of taste back, which is just horrible, you know. And imagine going through life without with no ability to appreciate all the different smells and tastes of food, right? I wouldn't want anybody to have that. One more reason to make sure you're as protected from this virus as possible.
So this might be a nice question kind of to wrap us up. With all the new vaccine information and misinformation coming out daily, how can we figure out what to believe and what to not?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say if you have a family doctor, if you don't have a family doctor, you should get a family doctor. I've actually talked about the vaccine and the virus with almost all my patients. Every time we have a visit, we're always here for you, you know, I would say that almost all family doctors in Alberta are up to date with the information and can use their sort of background knowledge and experience with disease, just in general, with how the body works, to help guide, to help provide some guidance and clarity around this matter. So that's my number one recommendation, is to go to your doctor to actually find out the right sources of information.
Okay, I just had one last question come in, so I'm going to ask that, and then we'll wrap up here. So it appears as though COVID will continue to be around for years to come. Why were we able to contain or eradicate other viruses such as H1N1? And further, if we get the double dose of COVID vaccine, how long can we expect the protection to last?
Yeah, so Pfizer, the scientists at Pfizer, I'll answer the second part of the question first. These are really good questions, by the way. I'll answer the second part first, which is Pfizer has said that, you know, at least double dose, the full series, that the 2 doses of the vaccine will last for at least a year. I haven't came across any statements from the Moderna scientists or the AstraZeneca scientists, but if you look at in theory how the human body works, your immune cells will probably last for a good few years. You might have, so for example, the childhood vaccinations, you know, against measles, mumps, rubella, things like that. When you've had those vaccines in childhood, and because we measure the level of defense or antibodies you have against these diseases in pregnant women, we know what their level of response, we know what their level of protection is. We can still detect antibodies against these potential viruses, you know, when they're pregnant, and that's about, you know, 20, 30 years after they get their childhood vaccines. And so nobody really knows for sure if the immune response from the COVID vaccines will last that long. And it's certainly, you know, even if the COVID immune response against the wild type or the original strain of COVID lasts that long, there might be other variants that come in that will require us to get vaccinated against those variants anyway, if we want to get protected. So I guess that the short answer to your question is we don't really know how long the protection will last, but it also depends on other factors, such as whether variants come into play. Now, for your first part of the question, why were we able to eradicate, contain other viruses such as H1N1? Well, you have to look at the properties of the virus itself. So H1N1 was not as transmissible as COVID. It's just the inherent characteristic of H1N1 made it so that it was not as easily transmissible. And whenever a virus infects somebody, if the person is able to recover from the virus, that virus actually, if the patient is able to recover from the virus and not transmit it to anybody else, then that virus essentially dies in the body of that recovered patient. And so when everybody has recovered from a virus and not transmitted it to other people, that virus is essentially gone. So when everybody in the world has recovered from a potential virus and not transmitted it to others, that's what we call eradication. So smallpox, for example, we were able to get the vaccine to smallpox and vaccinate enough people so that they don't get infected if they come into close contact with somebody who was infected. So that's the concept of herd immunity, which is why we're trying to get as many people vaccinated as possible. And then when those people recover, when those people who have been infected recover, that actually means that the virus is killed off during their process of recovery. And so, yeah, that's how we can eradicate.
So you had said earlier that you did expect that there would be a requirement for booster shots, or people would need booster shots. Do we have any knowledge right now around how often those would be required?
Not yet. The studies are still ongoing for that. So I expect, by the end of this year, we'll be able to have some information about that. So keep your eyes tuned for that.
Okay, I think that's all the questions we have. We got to all of them. We published all of them. We answered all of them. So thank you so much, Dr. Yu, for all of your time and your extra time this morning so that we were able to get to all of the questions. And thanks to everyone who showed up and asked all of these great questions so that, we all were able to learn from Dr. Yu's responses. I don't know if you have any closing words, Dr. Yu. If not, we'll say goodbye.
That's it. Thank you so much for your attention, everybody, and for being so open to coming to this session. And I hope everybody stays safe and is able to stay healthy for the rest of this.